Yeah. Okay, Mendy Singer, thank you very much for agreeing to this video. And I know you're going to be familiar to many Jewish people in the Southwest in particular, and it's chiefly through the public lighting of the Hanukkah candles. We were going to do this earlier, but unfortunately it was delayed. We both suffered serious family crises in 2023. But I've known you for a few years now, mainly from the Hanukkah lighting. And I have to say, Mendy, I, for one, have been more than just a little bit impressed with, you've got a fantastic ability to relate to all the different numerous strands of Jewish people, of which there are many. Different personalities, different levels of observance, and you have this friendly and engaging manner. You can speak to everyone. And your father, Rabbi Singer, lives in the same road as my brother in Unsworth. And I visited his shul in Sunnybank on a few times. There was the mitzvahs of my two nephews, one of whom is a contemporary of yours, Robert, and also for the service for it was the plaque unveiling for my late mother. And you come from a Lubavitch family, and what I'd like to know, Mendy, is more about your growing up in the area and your family. Let's start with that. What are your earliest memories?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your platform. Yes, the Cook family and the Singers, as you say, are just down the road from each other. And, you know, in shul growing up, there weren't that many boys my age, but Robert was definitely a good friend back then. So my family earliest memories, well, I grew up in Manchester, North Manchester, where my father's a rabbi at the Sunnybank shul. Although my parents lived in Israel before that, where all my siblings were born. So I'm the only one to be born outside of Israel.
Right.
They moved just a couple of years before I was born. Um, it was interesting because I went to kind of Orthodox Jewish schools in uh, North Manchester, so Broughton Park, Salford area. I actually went to a Yiddish-speaking school, so very Haredi in that sense. But I grew up just 4 or 5 miles down the road, further up north, where we were just outside the main Jewish community of North Manchester. I think the last outpost in that direction in the north.
So further north than Unsworth.
Well, no, Unsworth is further north than Prestwich and everything else. So
Right.
I think it's the last Jewish community as you go in that direction.
Right.
Yeah, so we didn't grow up surrounded by a Jewish community all around, but we used to drive every day to go to school through the traffic to go, school, shopping, friends, everything was, a little bit down the road.
Right.
I think a lot of, well, growing up, I was the youngest in the family. A lot of the influence on my life and decisions to move out to Bristol to be a Chabad representative in the Southwest was thanks to my upbringing, to my parents' example. You know, my father, in addition to his various roles, was also a hospital chaplain. And he would take me with him whenever it was appropriate. He would take me with him on his hospital rounds. I remember on Friday afternoons going to visit people. And as a young boy, that left a very strong impression.
Yes.
And it's something that I still do today, thankfully not too often. Sadly, I'm more often called to prisons than to hospitals. But it's one of the many hats that I wear. And a lot of it is thanks to my parents' inspiration. And I still... whenever I feel stuck, my first port of call will be my father for guidance and advice. Often, if it's a complex halachic issue, he might tell me, "Why didn't you call a real rabbi?" Although he's only got 40 years experience.
He's not a real rabbi?
Yes. Yeah, so... And then having grown up in a Chabad community, studied at Chabad yeshivas, Chabad and Lubavitch are synonymous, and the Rebbe's philosophy and kind of mission for their generation was very much to go out, to reach out, to care for every Jew, wherever they may be, in any way that you can help. And therefore, it was always a goal that one day we would open a Chabad house somewhere. We just didn't know where.
Right. And you ended up in Bristol.
You know, there's a Yiddish expression. They say, "A Mensch tracht und Gott lacht." In English, it's roughly a man plans and God laughs. I
Right.
I married an American and I got my green card and I was set on living in America. I was sure we were going to be somewhere in America, and I
With
had a
all
large
your
collection,
siblings. Yes.
a
With all
large
your
library.
siblings.
Over the years, I built up a lot of Jewish books. And after we got married, I was trying to ship them over and to have people bring over some of my books. Uh, and some of my friends were telling me, "You don't know where you're going to end up yet. Why don't you hold on? Keep them back in England at your parents for the meanwhile. And then when you settle down, you'll have them moved over." And I said, "Look, I don't know where I'm going to end up, but I know I'm not going back to England. I know I'm going to be somewhere in America. So I might as well bring them all to America." And sure enough, we ended up back in England. But,
Yeah. I'd like to know more about Chabad. I believe you run the whole center and its history and, to use a modern phrase, its mission statement, for want of a better word.
okay, how long have you got?
Well, we've only got 45 minutes because we get cut off
Okay,
because it's not the
right.
business one.
Okay. In a nutshell, so Chabad is a Hasidic group, which Hasidism was founded by the Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov going back some 300 years. There were various, let's put it, groups or strands over the generations. What made Chabad unique as opposed to other Hasidic groups was the focus on the study, the philosophy, the intellectual side of things, which would then lead to an emotional experience, as opposed to what the focus may have been in other Hasidic groups, tapping in straight to the emotion, the joy, the dancing, but without necessarily anything to back it up, as in a hardcore philosophical approach. And that Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who authored the Tanya, which is a founding work of Chabad philosophy, talks about intellect being parents and emotions being children. And parents give birth to children, and likewise, to have a real emotional experience has to be grounded on an intellectual approach. And again, if you think about the time frame, Western Enlightenment is sweeping across Europe at that time. If Jewish mysticism was only emotional and but not intellectual, it would have been left behind. So developing it on that front. So there's, but it's not pure Kabbalah in mysticism on its own, but it's
Not
very
like in
much
Tzfat.
right. So Tzfat has a strong Kabbalistic energy.
Yeah.
The Hasidic approach is to be able to extract practical application, living lessons. How does this inform our daily life? So, in other words, yes, we want to study the mysticism, the inner workings of things spiritually, get to appreciate God as much as humanly possible, but at the same time, practically, what does it mean? How does this inform us? So, therefore, Chabad philosophy is literally hundreds of books over the last couple of hundred years from the various Chabad Rebbes, masters, who, my library at home is mostly Chabad philosophy, and then I have Talmud and Jewish law. So that's going on for over, let's say, 250 odd years. Things shifted. A key dimension of Hasidism is it's based on having a Rebbe, a master, who is seen as a tzaddik, that has a special soul connection. And there were 7 Chabad Rebbes over the generations. Going back to the 6th Rebbe, his name was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, and he lived at a very unique time where it was no longer an insular Hasidic movement, but all of a sudden you had, based out of Russia, you had revolutions, things changing, crackdown on Judaism and all religion. Majority of rabbis left, were chased out, and the Jewish infrastructure was crumbling. Rabbi Schneerson was not about to be intimidated, and he stood strong against the regime to the point where they arrested him and sentenced him to death. Now, thankfully, with a lot of pressure, the American Foreign Office and the International Red Cross got involved. They commuted his sentence to some years of exile, and then eventually he was released relatively quickly on the condition that he leaves Russia. They said, we can't, Chabad, this counter-revolutionary Chabad spirit is not going down very well with our communist approach. So they wanted him to leave. Before he left, he gathered 10 of his closest students and followers, and they made a pact to do whatever it takes to keep the spark of Judaism alive in Russia to the last drop of blood. Now, these were 10 who then had many others under them, and they sacrificed incredible amounts to have underground shuls, Jewish schools, kosher, mikveh. Many of these people were sent off to Siberia, never to be heard of again, or 20-year sentences if they weren't shot on the spot. It was so bad at one point that if you were caught teaching Torah, then the odds are you wouldn't make it back home. So they, instead of sending young men, they would send who were married with a family at home. They would send yeshiva students who, at least if they got shipped off, wouldn't leave a wife and kids behind.
Right. Yes.
And this was a relatively untold story, but going on for decades. You had hundreds of devoted Chabad followers who kept a Jewish underground alive in Russia. And where it was expressed was when communism eventually fell and the Iron Curtain came down, all of a sudden you had not dozens, but hundreds of communities that came up from underground because they were there to a degree.
Yes.
and it was thanks to the sacrifice of people who literally gave their lives, who gave so much. So that defined Chabad in the sixth generation, going from the 1930s to the 1950s, but all the way through to the 80s. The Rabbi was the seventh Chabad leader who succeeded his father-in-law in 1951. So Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak eventually moves to America in 1940, sets up in New York, and then there's a new mission, American Jewry. And the joke was, they would say, the waters of Ellis Island were black with all the tefillin that were thrown overboard. Because people felt like the shtetl was for Europe and Orthodox Jewish life had no room in America.
Right.
And it was incredibly difficult to be able to keep Shabbat because before the various laws that allowed people the religious freedom of taking Shabbat off, it was incredibly difficult in those days to keep Shabbat. And when the previous Rabbi gets to New York, his first declaration is, America is no different. It's the same God, the same Judaism, the same Torah. We'll do that here. But fast forward to 1950s, so it's a post-Holocaust world. Survivors are trying to recreate bubbles in their communities where they are. And the Rebbe, in his very first address, sets out the mission statement, which is in one of his talks at that address in 1951, he said, there are a couple of loves. There is the love of God, the love of the Torah, and the love of a fellow Jew. And he says, you can't love the Torah or love God without the love of a fellow Jew. But vice versa, if you love the fellow Jew, you will come to love God and love the Torah. And he said, therefore, we have to reach out with love to bring God back into the world, to recreate a home for God, to spread Judaism to communities that need support. At the time, in the 50s and even in the 60s, the young Chabad couples were not particularly interested in moving around the world to establish centers where there was no support. It was so foreign, the concept of leaving an Orthodox Jewish community to go somewhere else, and where you become the whole community.
Yes.
There were literally, you could count on one hand how many couples actually moved out. And you had, there was the first Chabad representative to England, to Italy, and various countries that in the 50s and 60s started to pick up. But then in the 70s and 80s, it bloomed. The Rebbe passed away in 1904. The pundits at the time were saying, well, this is the end of the Chabad movement. Without leadership, it will fizzle out within the next few years. What's interesting is in the 30 years since then, the growth has been greater than the 40 years prior.
Oh, yeah.
So there are more on an annual basis or even on a daily basis, there almost every other day, there is a new Chabad center being established somewhere around the world.
In places where there's never been, or there's very little or thought to be no Jewish community at all.
Right. So if you go back 40 years, then it was like, okay, which country or which city? But then today it's, well, almost every major city would already have a Chabad presence. And then sometimes you're looking at smaller places or university campuses. And sometimes it may be support in an existing community. So if a community is growing, they may need a couple to work with teens, with seniors, et cetera, et cetera. So not always is it a new community. Sometimes it's extra growth within a community. Bristol was an interesting story because we were not the first Chabad presence in the Southwest. There were a couple of Chabad families who were emissaries before us. And for family reasons, they both moved on, which is very unusual. Typically, within the Chabad framework, when couples move out, it's a lifetime commitment. And you're there. You're not on a contract. If you're on your own, you have to raise the funds to support your work and your organization, and you build the community with your investment over time, as opposed to a headquarters sending someone down for a year or two and then replacing them. It's much more an organic growth that should reflect
But
what the local
people now have moved on or to other places.
Yeah, so occasionally people do move on. And in Bristol, there were two couples before us that eventually did move on. And there was a vacancy. They were looking for someone to work with the students at the university to support the local community, the shul. And that's where we came in 2015. Yeah.
That's, I mean, I think I knew about 5% of that. So that is interesting. And I like the way you brought it right up to the present day as well. And I do remember when the Iron Curtain fell, well, in Berlin in particular, when the wall came down, how the so-called 100 Jewish people became, I don't know, 1,000 or whatever, because they were all hiding, but were still there.
Right.
And what I've learned since coming here is that you'd be surprised how many Jewish people there are around in the most odd corners of the country. I'm in the process of bringing out a few more here. I think I've managed to increase the Jewish population down here by 100% every single year.
Yeah, so you mentioned the menorah lightings, and that's something that when we first started around the Southwest, we didn't know if we expect 10 people or 5 people or 20 people. And I think the first time we probably had close to 50. And it's been steady or growing. And then we added Plymouth. And, even in Bath is just down the road from Bristol.
Yes.
And we go to Bath every year. And there are always between 50 to 70, 80 people.
I know the first time I went, I was absolutely astonished by the number.
Yeah, and everyone is surprised. Where's everyone else coming from?
Yes. Well, have you heard the story about the Isle of Wight community, Jewish community, and what happened?
No.
The BBC, I think in a newspaper, said we're doing an article on Judaism. If there's anybody in the island who is Jewish, will they please contact me? And so a Jewish friend I made there said, well, I phoned them. And I said, well, I'm the only Jewish person on the island, so you'll need to speak to me. And they said, we've just had 20 people say the same thing. So as a result of that, they formed the Isle of Wight Jewish community.
Wow.
Yes, I was there for one Rosh Hashanah years ago. Yeah.
So sometimes BBC actually has good
Yeah,
results.
yes, for
Okay.
that. Yes.
Um, yeah. So because we're relatively thin, stretched on the ground, because we're based in Bristol, there's a limit to how much we can do further out.
Yes, yes.
Some of what I try and do is to make local connections. So yesterday, a woman in Frome called me, and she was just thankful that she moved there a couple of years ago, didn't know anyone Jewish, but now she's got half a dozen friends that I
Yes.
just introduced them to each other. They all agreed to share their numbers, and now
Yeah.
they get together and they've got
Yes.
a
Yes.
small group there.
A similar
In
thing
the
happened in Somerset, although now the chief person has moved out. But there was a Somerset Jewish group.
Yeah.
But at the moment, unfortunately, that's finished. Um,
Yeah.
um, and they would come to Exeter, as would Totnes, the
Right.
social group would come to Exeter as well for the lighting. So it
Right.
draws from a very large geographical area.
Yeah, I think in the long term, um, as part of my responsibilities directing Chabad in the Southwest, we would like to develop further and bring another family to service kind of the Devon, Exeter, Plymouth,
Yes.
Cornwall region, um, because there are communities there and
Well,
it
there's
would grow.
Kahillet Kerno is in Cornwall.
Right. And I think Chabad is uniquely positioned to be able to support Jewish people, regardless of, their level of religious observance or
Yes.
identity,
Yeah.
because everyone feels welcomed. Nobody is judged for what they do or don't do.
No, and that's
Um,
very, very important.
yeah.
Yes.
So in the long term, we would like to develop something more permanent and hopefully bring a family to establish Chabad of that region.
Yes.
Obviously, there are challenges along the way, bridges to cross, but we will get there.
Yes. Yes. Well, this sort of thing requires, I think this is all personality led. And that's why somebody like you can be successful and do this. You've got to have a degree of charisma to attract people to want to belong to the community and to get a lot of people together. And I think if you haven't got that, it's be very difficult for it to happen. Fortunately, though, Mendy Singer, you do. So we're all right.
Yeah. And to a degree, a lot of it is also, as I mentioned before, there's a philosophy and based on an understanding. And
Mhm.
while a lot of what I do might be more in the social side of things, um, sometimes we'll be delivering chicken soup to students who are not well, and their mothers will call from
Of
North London
course.
worried,
Yeah.
and or arranging events. But
Mm.
ultimately, the word rabbi in Hebrew, a rav or rebbe, means teacher.
Teacher, that's
Right?
right.
And the goal, kind of my end goal, is to teach Torah.
Yeah.
Now, yes, obviously we need to facilitate everything, and you can't teach people if they need other help first. Um, but I think when there is knowledge, it brings a sense of Jewish pride, of and strength, commitment, and people are more engaged. The more they understand and know, and that's some don't want to say tragedy of last couple of generations, but it's
Yeah.
something that
I
a
know.
lot of people may be proud Jews and keep certain traditions, but have absolutely no idea why.
Mm.
Some things we do out of guilt because of our parents and grandparents,
Yes.
and I think the more opportunities we have to study, to learn, to appreciate the why, the stronger we are. And
Yeah.
also now, in the face of all anti-Semitism and hatred, I think being an informed Jew from a Torah perspective, not just a political perspective, also gives us a sense of moral clarity and pride that actually we're not afraid of what we represent. Um, So that's definitely a
I think a
large
lot of
part
it
of what
is
I do.
also, yes, parental respect that you have. And I've seen the further you go away from the main areas, the less knowledgeable people tend to be. I mean, when I first came down here, somebody was astonished that you can read Hebrew. Yes, why shouldn't I? You know, you wouldn't really get that in London, for example. It would be no big deal.
Right. Meaning, if you go back, obviously you had there was there's Sunday
Yes,
schools and after school programs back in
yes,
the day.
yes,
I think it was the Rabbi, the chief Rabbi Lord Jacobowitz, who quipped. He said that a shul keeps Jews, but a Jewish school makes Jews.
yes, yes,
And
indeed.
and that is, if you look historically, let's say the last 100 and odd years of Jewish communities in England, Wales, um, so many provincial communities have disappeared
Yeah,
in places where they were relatively strong. If you like, just down the road from us, South Wales, at one
yes,
point there were at least 10 shuls, and
yeah.
now they've got Cardiff,
One's
which is
quite famous, isn't it? Merthyr Tydfil one.
right, which has been
Yes, a
gone through
beautiful
renovation.
building. Yeah,
Um, and now they've got Cardiff, which is struggling to hold on. But uh, and across the country, you had so many communities.
yeah.
But perhaps what they were missing was their education. That they, outside of London,
That's an
Manchester, Liverpool,
interesting.
Leeds, Birmingham, you
Yeah,
didn't have Jewish schools anywhere.
that's an interesting
Now,
observation.
obviously, there are economic factors of
Yeah.
young people moving to big
Yes, they
cities,
want
etc.,
to make
etc.
more money, so they go to
Yeah,
the big city.
obviously that does
Yeah.
play a factor, but a large part is Jewish education,
Yes.
which will influence whether the next generation will be Jewish.
But there's nothing like I went to a Jewish school and, we now have reunions and we've all got to know each other again. And, I tell my brother like all the funny stories and things. And he always says that could only happen in a Jewish school, what you're describing.
Right. Yeah, so Jewish schools personally for us now is a challenge because our children are at home. There are no Jewish schools in the area. So Chabad today has an online virtual school, which this is pre-COVID. It's been going on for
Yeah.
about 20 odd years.
So this assists
And
with homeschooling.
so, yeah, so they're learning from home, but they've got online classes. And there was a European division, but then we basically had to choose between an Israeli division, so Hebrew speaking classes on Israeli time, which 9 o'clock in the morning is 7 o'clock for us,
Yes.
or English speaking classes on American time, which is 2 in the afternoon. So
Right.
we chose to try the Israeli school, and we were amazed how quickly the girls picked up Hebrew.
Right.
When they're young,
And it's like living there if you're so directly involved with them.
yeah,
Yeah.
so their teachers are based, and the school is based out of Israel, but their classmates are literally all around the world, from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China,
Gosh, gosh.
uh, Holland, Germany, anywhere where there are in similar situations, so communities without a Jewish school, then the Chabad families will probably be using the Chabad
And
online
you
school.
you have 5 children, Mendy.
Yes, so 5 girls, thank
Oh,
God.
they're all girls. I wondered because I've seen
All
some.
girls.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
so far.
Yeah. I've been told we're gonna have to leave soon because the time's up on Zoom. So
So any
right. Um, can you hear me? Sorry, we've gone off.
oops, yeah, you just muted me for a second, but I'm
Yeah,
back.
yeah,
Yeah,
I did it by mistake. But thank you very, very much, Mendy. I'll stop the recording now and we'll speak shortly.
amazing.
Bye.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.